Hey guys, it's Trenton, what's up? Today I'm happy to announce that on my speedrun of becoming a YouTuber, we've finally hit the stage of having our first YouTuber drama. Woo! Yeah! But I'll get to that in a second. 皆さんはもう見たはずなんだけど、チャンネルを人気にした動画がめちゃバズってて、100万再生回数まで達成できた。どうやってここまで伸びたのかわかんないんだけど、まあ、ありがとね。前の動画でインプットが一番大事だってずっと主張してて、教科書と授業で言語を勉強するのはあまり効果的じゃないって言った。つまり、言語を触れれば触れるほど上手くなるということです。インプットに基づいてる学習方法は何年前からネットに広まってて、もともと AJAT とか、マート・オブ・ヤスス・ジャパンとか、スティーブ・コーフマンさんによって広められたんです。主にインプットだけで日本語を覚えたので、このチャンネルの目的は自分の経験をシェアして、日本語がはかどらない人に役に立つ情報を届けることです。でもやっぱりね、教科書をつけてインプットで勉強した方がいいよって言うと、意見の合わない人が結構多い。That's why when I saw this video, I was honestly surprised that it didn't happen sooner. The only video reacting to it that I'd seen until now was by this Russian language learning YouTuber who referred to it as this one guy's ingenious video, where he basically just praises me for 13.5 minutes.
Единственный, самый главный, самый классный, самый крутой метод для изучения языков, то это был бы именно тот, о котором человек говорит в этом видео.
Thank you, Russian man. So a few days ago, Oriental Pearl made a video called YouTube Gives Bad Language Advice. Oh hey, that's me. I wonder what she's implying here. When I saw this thumbnail, I thought, oh boy, she's coming out swinging. This is war. I have to prepare every defense mechanism. Oh no, that was just mostly clickbait. Given the antagonistic thumbnail implications, I was kind of surprised to see that her video was actually somewhat tame, and she didn't just straight up dismiss everything that I said. She did, however, say a few things that made me stop and go, okay, no, I really disagree on that. Now, before I was able to get this video out, she made the video members only, so you can't view it publicly on her channel, but it was public for like a day or two after release, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to explain why I advocate for the things I do. She reacts to another person's video as well, but I'm not going to be responding to that, just the stuff that she specifically disagrees with me on, so I'm not going to be showing everything, but hopefully I can convince you guys that I am in fact not a YouTube liar. I know I said this is YouTube drama, but that was just me being dramatic. It's not really anything serious. I really just want to clarify some of the reasons for why I give the advice I do, and I think responding to this video is a good opportunity to do that. So in my video about immersion learning, I referenced this man, Stephen Krashen, who is a linguist who's come out with some hypotheses about how humans acquire language, the most common of which being the input hypothesis, which essentially just explains the mechanism for why input learning works. This is basically just the claim that humans acquire language with comprehensible input, which means that understanding input which is slightly above your level is what's going to grow your ability. This is also coupled with the idea that there's a distinction between natural acquisition and learning through study, and acquisition can only occur when exposed to mass input in a language. There's this linguist named Stephen Krashen who's pretty popular among people doing an immersion method, and he has this awesome video from like the 80s where he explains the concept of comprehensible input, and I would highly recommend watching it.
A YouTuber that I have talked to before called Language Jones just made a video not too long ago about how people really misinterpreted what Krashen had said, and also that his methods are not proven in the language learning sphere of academia. But man, YouTubers love to talk about this guy.
The second that I mention Krashen, Pearl facepalms and brings up how YouTubers like to bring this guy up, despite how his ideas are not proven in the field of linguistics. This is true, but it's actually not as important as you'd think. For some background, I actually have a degree in linguistics and second language education, and I think it's important to understand that linguistics as a field itself is essentially built upon frameworks which aren't proven, and linguists themselves can't agree on basically anything. I've talked to people in the field who think Krashen is completely wrong, and I've also talked to people who are supportive and receptive to his ideas. So just saying they aren't proven is meaningless because a lot of stuff in linguistics isn't proven in the first place.
Anyone who's going to spend the time and effort to learn a language should understand how the process works. And there is no better explainer than Stephen Krashen. And I think it's important for people who are interested to learn, a language, interested in language learning, that they understand how the process works. And the best explainer of how we learn languages, in my opinion, by far, is Stephen Krashen.
My point is, until we know more about what actually happens in the brain in regard to language, a lot of linguistic theory is unable to be proven, quote unquote, so dismissing Krashen's ideas for the same reason is unfair in my opinion. This isn't to say that I agree with everything Krashen says, but the principles, whether they can be proven or not, are undoubtedly effective for language learning. There's also the fact that linguistics and language learning are not actually as related as you would think they are. Having spent a lot of time observing linguistic academia, something I've noticed is that just because someone knows a lot about linguistics does not mean that they necessarily know how to learn a language effectively. In the same way, just because someone knows a lot about learning languages doesn't mean they would make a good linguist. People who are interested in one are more likely to be interested in the other, but knowledge of the two areas aren't really going to translate that well into each other all the time. The reason YouTubers like to bring this guy up, and the reason why this guy seems to have such a cult following online, is because his ideas have helped so many people, and those people have become very passionate because they've seen the results for themselves. It's really easy to write off input learning when you have never experienced it for yourself, but if you've learned a language through input, then you know what I'm talking about. You can argue about what is quote-unquote proven in the field of linguistics, but at the end of the day, people like to talk about Krashen because his ideas have worked for them, which has been the case for me and many other people that I know. I've seen countless people fail to learn a language with traditional methods, but I've never seen anyone fail at immersion learning to the extent that they actually kept doing it for a long time. My point is, Krashen says input, 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 and you're never going to find someone who got fluent in a language without tons of input, whether they were aware of it at the time or not. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is tolerating ambiguity. Tolerating ambiguity is the idea that you need to be okay with being unable to understand things in your target language, and I've talked many times about this in my videos because it's super important. If you think about the general learning process of basically any skill, you make the most progress by spending time practicing things that you're not good at so that you can improve. If you spend all of your time practicing things that you're already good at, you're not going to improve. It's that simple. It's the same thing with learning to understand your target language. If you only spend time with material which you can already understand, your room for growth is severely limited. I would highly recommend this video from Matt vs. Japan called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language, and honestly I think this might be the best language learning video on YouTube. It's got so much good information and I think it's a must watch for anybody. So when I said that you have to spend a lot of time listening to stuff that you don't understand everything to yet, Pearl had this to say. You're gonna have to spend a lot of time listening to things that you can't really understand yet, and that's okay. Because by trying to listen to those things for thousands of hours, you'll become able to understand it.
Stuff that
this
you don't
happened
understand.
to me, this happened to everyone else I know that's done an immersion method, and you're probably still thinking.
No, don't start that hard. You're doing yourself a disservice starting that hard. And maybe that's your end goal, to be able to understand that, but work your way up. I didn't get to read The Hunchback of Notre Dame in Japanese by starting with The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I started with the textbooks and then maybe moved up to Harry Potter and then moved up a little higher and got there slowly. You can do the same thing, and you should do the same thing with your listening as well. Don't start off too hard. It's just going to be in one ear, out the next.
I actually don't think we disagree on this point that much, but either I didn't correctly articulate what this means well enough, or she misinterpreted what I said. She talks about moving the difficulty up slowly over time, which is something that I've also advocated for on my channel and completely agree with. Tolerating ambiguity doesn't mean that I'm saying you should listen to something which you understand almost nothing of. It's far more efficient to listen to things which you understand around 50 to 70% of, because you're going to be left with a lot of things to pick up, but you also have a lot to work with in terms of what is made comprehensible by the connections you can draw from the stuff you already understand. It's really difficult to find this sort of content in the beginning, so I've also advocated for doing some studying and using beginner content in order to build a foundation. Even if you're taking an approach of slowly upping the difficulty of the material you use, you still need to be okay with tolerating ambiguity and continue listening despite not understanding everything. You're not going to improve without doing that. She also mentions how not understanding things can kill morale, which is exactly why I believe that being okay with not understanding is really important in the first place.
It's also not going to give you a lot of confidence. You feel a lot better about learning and more motivated when you can at least understand some of it. People say that about my videos all the time. Wow, I actually understood most of that conversation. Do you know how motivating that is to people? And how demotivating it is when you turn on when you've been studying Japanese for a while, you turn on an anime and it's like, I got like 10% of that. Then you see how much further you have to go, and it kills the morale a lot.
If your morale is broken by something as simple as not understanding something, you're approaching language learning in the wrong way. If you make yourself okay with ambiguity and have the mindset of, I can't understand this now, but I'm improving every day and eventually I'll get there, then you're not going to be demotivated by something as simple as not understanding something. If you understand that learning a language is a long process and you're prepared to undertake that long process, then this shouldn't be an issue for you, and that's why tolerating ambiguity is so important. Next is something kind of small, but in my video I have some background footage of my Anki deck, and she mentions how the word "kolshul" is never used and sort of pokes fun at it being there. Being able to very quickly remember the rough definition of a word through Anki.
That word that just came up is never used. Good example. Yeah.
Just because a word is rare and isn't really used in spoken speech doesn't mean that it's not useful. I mine all of my words from content that I'm consuming, so considering that this is in my deck, I had to have found it somewhere. When your goal is to reach near native level in the long run, then you're gonna have to learn words that rarely come up, because if a Japanese person knows it, then you gotta know it too. Now, I'm not saying that this is everybody's goal, but if you're still a beginner or intermediate learner, then don't mine words like this. But if you're at the point that I'm at and you basically know all of the common words, then you're gonna have to start mining things that are pretty rare. She also says this about vocab mining. Once you feel like you've got a pretty solid base down, you can start doing what most people call mining, which is essentially just taking words or sentences from content you've been listening to or reading.
Fair enough, but I mean, there's tools that make it easier, like they have entire textbooks that have already done this work for you.
This is just something that I completely disagree with. Using Anki and mining from your immersion is, in my opinion, the most efficient way to grow your vocabulary very quickly, and I don't understand how using a textbook that has arbitrarily picked words for you and memorizing them without an SRS is a better option, especially with how streamlined making cards has become in the past few years. Check out my video on Anki if you want to learn more about this. In my video, I said learning how to write kanji is useless, which elicited this reaction. Personally, I found a lot of success building up comfort by writing, and no, I don't mean writing kanji by hand because that's practically useless
Writing
nowadays.
kanji is useless?
No.
No. Writing kanji is useless. Why do I have these kanji kante books? What am I doing with my life with these kanji books?
We need kanji.
He's saying writing is useless.
Writing.
Do you think it's useless?
Uh,
If you live in America,
maybe.
versus live in Japan. I don't know what the hell this guy's even studying Japanese for, so maybe it's useless for him. I don't know what his goal is. I mean, you could say anything is useless depending on what your goal is. Speaking well is, having a good accent is useless because I'm just gonna write my thesis or something. I don't know. I mean, you could say any part of the language is useless depending on what your goal is. But if you want overall balanced learning, then yeah, you gotta learn how to write too.
Now, I kind of regret using the word useless because it kind of implies that I'm against writing kanji in its entirety, but my main point is that for most people learning Japanese, you don't need to spend your time learning how to write, especially if you're still a beginner. Learning how to write kanji has almost no practical benefit to learning to read the characters, learning how to understand spoken speech, learning how to speak, or any other part of the language, so unless you specifically care about learning how to write, you can skip it until you're at the point in which you want to go back and learn it, which might be never. You can live your life completely fine without knowing how to write by hand, because most communication is done by typing nowadays, so even the younger generations of Japanese people are forgetting how to write some more complex kanji. It's way more practical to spend your time learning to read the characters first, then go back and learn how to write them if you want to do it. Watch my video about kanji if you want to hear me talk more about this. Pearl mentions that some parts of the language can be considered useless for different people depending on what your goals are, which I actually completely agree with. But she also says that learning how to write kanji is necessary for a balanced approach, which I would completely disagree on for reasons which I mentioned earlier.
I mean, this is YouTube, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think there's a reason that these kind of videos just do input. I think there's a reason that it appeals to people who are kind of a little bit shy, a little bit insecure, and on YouTube a lot. So this is very niche YouTube stuff. In the real world, how much of that applies? You be the judge of that.
Saying that people who are attracted to input methods are insecure comes across as a bit insulting, to be honest, and I would completely disagree with this idea. People are drawn to input methods because they work, many of those people having seen the inefficiencies of traditional study firsthand. Learning a language with input doesn't mean that you have to lock yourself in a room all day and talk to nobody. It just means that you're choosing the language itself to be your learning material, not a textbook. So many of the comments on my original video were just people saying, "Oh yeah, this is just how I learned English, by being on the internet all the time." I've talked about it in other videos, but I learned Japanese through almost exclusively passive listening at my job, talking to people online through Discord, Line, HelloTalk, VR chat, etc. And most of the people who I know who use the same method are in the same boat. You could say that, yeah, input learning is very suited for introverted or shy people, but that's less to do with the method itself and more about people's personalities. Okay, that's the end of my rant. Let me know your opinions in the comments. And again, this video's goal is to give some context to the things that I've advocated for that may have some disagreements. Despite some disagreements on language learning methodology, I don't have any negative feelings towards Pearl, and I'm not upset that she used my video or said the things that she did. Anyways, that's about it. Catch you guys in the next one.